everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The Iron Door. Caroline Winters had spent all 32 years of her life in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a city whose winding streets and weathered stone facades had become as familiar to her as the pages of the history books she studied. As an archivist at the university library, Caroline had devoted herself to cataloging the subtle transformations of buildings, parks and neighborhoods, chronicling the city's evolution like a living document. She found peace in the predictability of her life and in the comforting regularity of her routines. Twice a week, weather permitting, she and her colleague Diane would stroll through Mount Auburn Cemetery during their lunch breaks. The cemetery, the oldest garden-style burial ground in America, was less a graveyard and more a sanctuary, an oasis of sculpture-lined paths, ancient trees, and stone angels silently keeping watch. Caroline loved the way the maple leaves ignited into shades of gold and red in the fall, how the sun dappled through the branches and stretched shadows across the moss-covered tombstones. Diane, older and quieter, had worked in the archives for more than 2 decades and approached their walks through the cemetery with the same meticulous curiosity. She applied to dusty tomes. She often paused to jot notes in her leather-bound notebook, recording the smallest changes. A tilted gravestone, a crack in a statue's base, or a plaque that seemed just slightly askew. Everything changes, she would murmur with quiet finality. Even the dead don't rest easy. It was one such November afternoon, when their peaceful routine took a turn that neither of them would ever forget. They had just passed the familiar silhouette of Bigelow Chapel, its spires reaching toward a sky layered in thick, grey clouds, when Diane froze in her tracks and clutched Caroline's arm with startling force. "That wasn't here yesterday," she whispered, her voice strange and stretched like a warped record. Caroline's eyes followed Diane's gaze and settled on an object that didn't belong. A freestanding iron door, standing alone among the graves, its matte black surface absorbing the dim light like velvet. There were no walls, no hinges, no frame, just the door. It stood as if placed there by some unseen hand, tall and solemn, and deeply out of place. Caroline blinked, and then looked again, convinced her eyes were playing tricks on her. "We must have missed it before," she said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. But deep down she knew she was lying, to Diane and to herself. They had walked this path 100 times. They would have noticed something so bizarre, so utterly foreign. Diane shook her head, her fingers flipping rapidly through the pages of her notebook. No, I was just here last Thursday. I took notes. See, the Hamilton plot, the weathered urn by the rosebush. There was nothing there, just grass and stone." Caroline stepped off the path, her shoes crunching against the frosty lawn. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the silence. She drew closer to the door, her breath fogging in the suddenly colder air, and noticed that the brass handle shimmered faintly, like it was glowing from within. There was no sign of a foundation, no footprints, no disturbance in the earth. It hadn't been dragged or carried. It had simply appeared. The door gave off a warmth that felt alive, like something was pulsing beneath its surface. It reminded her, in a strange and unwelcome way, of stories she had read. Accounts of disappearances, people vanishing into thin air around Cambridge earlier that year, a professor, a pair of undergraduates, and an elderly woman named Mrs. Holdsworth had all gone missing. No signs of struggle, no real clues, just the faint whiff of unsolved mystery clinging to the stories like dust. The cases had been quietly shelved as time passed, but now, standing before that impossible door, those memories returned with sharp clarity. "We should report this," she said, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Her eyes were locked on the brass handle, and her body leaned unconsciously forward, compelled by something she couldn't explain. Diane pulled out her phone and began taking photos, but each one came out blurry, as if the camera couldn't properly focus. "It's like it's not even there," she said, her voice trembling. But Caroline wasn't listening. Her hand hovered inches from the handle. The metal seemed to radiate warmth and a quiet pulse, like a heartbeat, or like something was waiting behind the door. She touched it. It felt pliant, soft beneath her fingers, and the door swung open without sound, revealing what looked like the interior of a vast, endless library. Shelves extended upwards into darkness, stacked with books whose titles shimmered in languages she didn't recognize. The air was heavy and warm, rich with the sickly sweet scent of rotting fruit and decaying parchment. No shadows were cast, though the space was lit by a strange ambient glow. And seated at a desk within, back turned to her, was someone who looked starkly like Professor Adler, the first of the missing. "Professor," she called, her voice quiet and dull, like it had been swallowed by the space beyond. The man turned slowly, and her breath caught in her throat. It was Adler, but not quite. His features were too smooth, his expression too symmetrical. His eyes were solid black, and his mouth spread into a wide, unnatural grin. "Caroline," the thing said, its voice oddly melodic. "We've been waiting for you. So many books, so many stories to catalogue." Behind him, Caroline saw others. The missing students, Mrs. Holdsworth, and others she didn't know, all moving like puppets with invisible strings. Their faces wore the same two perfect smiles, and emotions were jerky, mechanical. The shelves they wandered between seemed to stretch forever in every direction. The whispering of 1,000 pages turning filled the air, and the cold dread in her chest blossomed into full-blown terror. Diane's voice came from behind her, distant and panicked. "Caroline, don't look at it. Step away." But her feet felt rooted to the ground. The warmth from the door had enveloped her, and the pull of the library was almost impossible to resist. Still, somehow, she managed to turn. Diane's hand gripped her sleeve, yanking her back with desperate strength. She stumbled and fell onto the cold grass, the warmth vanishing instantly. The door, untouched by wind or hand, slowly began to swing shut. Caroline looked back just in time to see Professor Adler's face peering through the narrowing gap. His smile lingered even as darkness swallowed his features. And then the door was gone, vanished, leaving nothing behind but undisturbed grass and a bone-deep chill. Campus security found nothing unusual. The police filed yet another inconclusive report. Even the photos Diane had taken showed nothing but empty air. Caroline requested a transfer to another department, far from the archives in the past. She no longer walked through the cemetery. She stopped reading old missing persons flyers, but sometimes, alone in her apartment at night, she would catch the faint rustling of turning pages and smell that cloying scent of ancient paper. She never kept books on her bedside table anymore. Diane retired early and moved to Arizona, though her letters came less frequently now. In her last note, she confessed that she had begun seeing doors where there shouldn't be any, in desert fields, parking lots, and once reflected in her bathroom mirror when she was alone. Caroline tried to ignore the world behind the iron door. She told herself it was gone, buried in memory. But a week ago, a letter arrived from the university's facilities department, announcing the installation of new emergency exits in the basement. The letterhead featured a simple image, a black iron door with a brass handle. The paper was warm to the touch. She burned it in her sink without reading the rest, watching the flames curl the corners until it was ash. But later, in the reflection of her darkened kitchen window, she saw her own face, and for just a second, only a breath, her eyes looked darker than she remembered. Her smile stretched just a little too far, and somewhere behind that smile, in a place she didn't dare name, she heard the soft, rhythmic fluttering of pages turning in the dark. Story 2. The handprints on the mirror. Time doesn't move the way most people think it does. It doesn't flow like water, smooth and forward. It crawls like honey, slow, viscous, and strangely reluctant. Time clings to the moments that shape us and resists those we try to forget. I learned this not from books or lectures, but from something far more personal, an experience that unraveled the core of everything I believed about reality. It started with a handprint, a simple, barely visible handprint on my bathroom mirror one February morning, smudged and faint, as if someone had pressed their palm lightly against the glass while it was still fogged from the shower. I had assumed it was mine, or maybe my brother's, even though I lived alone. I remember standing there under the harsh white light, still foggy from a night of running simulations at MIT's quantum physics lab. staring at that mark like it meant something. I wiped it away and went about my day, chalking it up to sleep deprivation. But the next morning, the handprint returned. This time it was clearer, more defined. I could see the swirl of fingerprints, the faint scar across the ring finger, the curve of the palm. It matched mine exactly, down to the long, narrow shape of the fingers, even the slight crook where I'd broken a bone playing basketball years ago. Still, I tried to be rational. I cleaned it again, took a photo this time, and made a note in a new journal. I wanted to dismiss it, to file it away as a trick of the mind, but part of me knew something was wrong, something fundamental. It didn't fade with time. It deepened, like a memory trying to surface, or a warning trying to break through. Each morning after that, a new print appeared. Some small, some larger, some pressed gently, others smeared like they were dragging along the glass in desperation. I began to obsess. I skipped meals. I stayed up late comparing photos, running spectral analysis on the distortion patterns, and then, one morning, I found not just a print but a word, written in reverse, so I could read it in the mirror's reflection. Don't trust him. Just those 3 words. Nothing else. No explanation. I stared at it for hours, heart pounding, mind racing through possibilities. Who was him? What did I need to know? I tried to dismiss it, tried to believe it was my own subconscious unraveling from lack of sleep, but the prints kept coming, and with them came dreams. In my dreams, I saw myself, older, worn down, frantic. I would be screaming at something behind glass, slamming my hands on the surface, mouthing words I couldn't hear. The dreams bled into my waking life. Every mirror, every reflective surface began to feel like a window that showed me not just who I was, but who I might become. I started to believe these prints weren't from someone else. They were from me. Or rather, from a version of me I hadn't met yet. A future me, one that was trying, desperately, to change something. That's when I realized the warnings were a message sent through time. A message that had something to do with my research. My name is Dr. Alexandra Hayes. I've spent the better part of my adult life studying the Wheeler-DeWitt equation and the implications of time symmetry on quantum mechanics. At MIT, I lead a team investigating temporal loops and closed time-like curves, and for the last several months, my team had been working on a theory of information transmission through entangled quantum states across time. It was theoretical. It was fragile. But we believed it was possible to send a signal, not through space, but through time itself. The idea had fascinated me, until it became personal, until I started receiving those signals in the form of mirror messages and smudged handprints, until I began to understand that some version of me was trying to stop something catastrophic. At first, I thought the danger was the technology itself, that we were on the brink of opening something that shouldn't be opened. But as the days passed, a different fear took shape. It wasn't just about the research, it was about trust. The message had said not to trust him, and slowly I realized who it was referring to. Raj, my assistant. He was brilliant, dedicated, always at my side. But lately he had changed. He had begun asking questions about military funding, about the potential for defense contracts, about applications I hadn't authorized. I noticed how he always arrived early, how he seemed to know things before I said them, how his eyes would linger just a second too long when I left the lab late at night. The more I watched him, the more convinced I became. Something was wrong. 3 weeks after the first handprint, I followed a new message. It gave coordinates, just a string of numbers written in fog. I memorized them before they faded and mapped the location. It led me to a storage unit on the outskirts of town. Inside, I found a USB drive hidden behind a loose panel. What it contained changed everything. Schematics, communications, files, proof that Raj wasn't who he claimed to be. He had ties to organizations that would use our research to weaponize time itself, to rewrite history, to fracture causality in ways we couldn't predict. My future self had tried to stop it, and now it was up to me to finish the job. That night, I dreamt of blood, of timelines unraveling, of 1,000 versions of myself dying in 1,000 different ways, all failing to stop what was coming. The next morning, the mirror wasn't fogged. It was slick with red, The words were clear. He knows. I ran to the lab. Raj was gone. The whiteboards wiped. The servers erased. Backup drive stolen. I found his access logs and tracked him across campus. He was headed for the river, where a boat waited in the early dawn fog. I chased him. The icy wind cutting through me, the weight of every future collapsing into one unbearable moment. On the bridge, he turned to face me. "You were never supposed to make it work," he said softly. "We were just supposed to scare them, not change everything." He pulled a knife, but I was faster. This version of me was ready. I knocked him off balance, and he slipped, the river swallowing him in silence. That night, for the first time in weeks, the mirror was clean. No prints, no messages, just my reflection, tired and hollow, staring back. I burned the research, every file, every equation. I knew now that some knowledge is too dangerous. Time isn't a straight line, it's a web, and we are all tangled in it, threads crossing and pulling and sometimes breaking. In some timeline I died, in others I failed. But here now I was alive, and I had a chance to stop the damage before it began. Still, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and check the mirror, not because I expect a message, but because a part of me misses her, that future version of myself, the one who screamed into glass, trying to save a version of us she would never meet. She sacrificed herself to reach me, to rewrite a story she was trapped in. And now I carry her warning like a scar etched into the mirror of my soul. Time, I've learned, isn't just a measurement. It's a voice. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear it whispering to you through glass, through silence, through memory. The whisper of your own hands trying to guide you back, trying to help you see what comes next, trying, against all odds, to keep you from making the same mistake again. Story 3. The Red Slippers. Sarah Mitchell had spent the last 15 years living the role of a perfect suburban wife, hosting dinner parties, attending ballet recitals, and managing the domestic sphere with a quiet kind of efficiency. But now, on a chilly February evening, she sat alone on the Boston subway, watching the reflection of her carefully made-up face flicker against the smudged window. Her brown hair was styled to hide the grey, her lips painted with a shade Richard once said made her look elegant, and in her bag were the divorce papers she had finally signed after discovering his affair. The betrayal had come with photographic clarity, texts, receipts, and the lingering scent of perfume not her own. Yet even with her signature on the final line, she didn't feel liberated. She felt untethered. Her world, once a ballet of predictability and purpose, had become a silence that echoed. That's when she saw them. Red ballet slippers, abandoned on the subway seat across from her, glowing faintly under the fluorescent lights like embers in cooling ash. They were pristine, untouched by dust or time, and the color was captivating. Not quite blood, not quite wine, something deeper, more ancient. Sarah blinked, half expecting them to vanish, but they remained. No one else seemed to notice. The old man near the door didn't look their way. The teenager with headphones bobbed his head to an inaudible rhythm, and the woman reading a novel didn't glance up once. Sarah leaned forward, drawn inexplicably toward the shoes. Her hands moved on their own, slipping the slippers into her gym bag, as if retrieving something she'd merely misplaced. "I'll turn them in tomorrow," she told herself, the lie settling on her tongue like sugar. As she stepped off the train at Downtown Crossing, the February wind sliced through her coat. She tightened her scarf and felt the weight of the slippers pull slightly at her shoulder, as though they resented being taken but had chosen her nonetheless. Her new apartment was small, cluttered with boxes, and far from the manicured sterility of her former home. It smelled like varnish and old wood, and the heating was temperamental. But Sarah liked the imperfection. It reminded her that she was starting over. Inside, her 13-year-old daughter Emma practiced ballet in front of the tall mirror Sarah had propped against the wall. Emma was grace incarnate, long-limbed, precise, determined. She had inherited Sarah's build and drive, but not yet her disappointment. "You're late," Emma said, not looking away from her pose. "Miss Caroline says I need new slippers for the spring showcase. Mine are falling apart." Sarah hesitated, one hand still gripping the bag that now pulsed subtly with presence. She thought of offering the red slippers, just to see them on Emma's feet, just to share something extraordinary. but something deep inside warned her. "We'll go shopping this weekend," she said instead, forcing a smile. "Something comfortable. Something new." That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah sat on her bedroom floor and pulled the slippers from the tissue paper she'd wrapped them in. They felt warm, alive even. As she held them under the soft glow of her bedside lamp, turning them over, she discovered a name written on the sole in faded black ink. Catherine Edwards, 1954. The name meant nothing, but the year stuck in her mind. Sarah slipped off her shoes, feeling foolish but curious, and slid her feet into the slippers. They shouldn't have fit, not after decades and the changes of time. But they did, perfectly, as if they'd been made for her. The room shifted, the air thickened, and then she was dancing, effortlessly, beautifully, moving with a grace she hadn't felt since she was Emma's age. In the mirror, her face blurred and transformed, merging with the image of a young woman she didn't recognize but somehow knew. The vision vanished just as suddenly, and Sarah collapsed, gasping for air. When she finally pried the slippers from her feet, the soles of her heels bled in perfect crimson circles, as though bitten. She should have burned them, should have thrown them out the window, but instead, she wrapped them up and tucked them into the back of her closet. They were too precious, too powerful, and she couldn't explain why. The next morning brought Claire, her closest friend from college, for a visit. Claire had never married, never compromised, and never hesitated to point out the places where Sarah had. As they chatted over coffee, Claire's eyes locked onto the red slippers lying on the dresser. "Where did you get those?" she asked, her voice strangely hollow. "They're beautiful. I've started dancing again. You know." Sarah felt a knot twist in her stomach. "They're not for sale," she replied curtly. Claire raised an eyebrow. "You never did learn to share," she said coolly, reaching for the slippers. It happened quickly. The hammer was in Sarah's hand before she even registered her movement. 1, 2, 3 strikes, and Claire lay crumpled on the floor, eyes wide in betrayal, blood pooling around her like a spilled memory. The slippers had somehow found their way back onto Sarah's feet, the satin now soaked in red, yet gleaming. She untied them gently and wiped them clean, whispering apologies to no one in particular. That night, she dreamt of Catherine Edwards again, of a 1950s studio, of a jealous rival named Rachel Morgan, of betrayal, murder, and buried secrets. Catherine had been brilliant, radiant, and pregnant. Rachel had been envious, desperate, and dark. Sarah woke with the taste of copper in her mouth and her pillow soaked with sweat. The dreams continued night after night, retelling the story like a loop that never resolved, like a wound that refused to close. Emma, too, began to change. Sarah caught her once, twirling in the slippers, eyes glowing with something too fierce to be innocent. That same day, Emma broke a classmate's ankle during rehearsal. "She got in my way," Emma had muttered. Sarah slapped her, hard. "The shoes are mine," she hissed. "You'll never wear them again." Emma's eyes burned with something ancient. The old woman in the basement, Mrs. Chen, finally told Sarah the truth. "You have her face," the woman whispered. "Rachel Morgan's. I was there. I saw what she did. The shoes were cursed by Catherine's blood. She wants revenge." Sarah tried to deny it, but the reflection in her mirror told another story. Rachel's face stared back now, twisted in rage and regret. A mask she couldn't take off. The slippers had chosen her for a reason. Detective James Martinez knocked on her door 3 days later, investigating Claire's disappearance. He moved like a dancer, spoke with precision. "You used to dance," she said, interrupting his questions. He nodded. "Catherine was my grandmother." Sarah felt the world tilt. He knew. He knew everything. Before she could act, he caught her wrist. Eyes locked on hers. "You've worn them long enough," he said. And then Catherine stepped from the mirror, bloody, barefoot, vengeful. Her ghost hissed Rachel's name, and the slippers began to burn. Sarah danced as if possessed, the shoes guiding her to the rooftop, her body no longer her own. Emma watched from the window as Sarah's final step carried her into the sky. The slippers remained behind, untouched by snow or time, waiting. 10 years later, Emma Mitchell runs a prestigious dance academy. She is revered for her talent and feared for her discipline. The red slippers rest in a glass case in her private studio, silent but watchful. Students come and go, dazzled by her brilliance, unaware of the fate that clings to the shoes like a second shadow. When dancers disappear, no one asks questions. When strange music plays in the dark halls at night, no one speaks of it. And if sometimes a mirror reflects a face that isn't quite your own, well, that's just the studio's atmosphere, they say. But Emma knows the truth. The performance never ends. The dance continues, and the slippers will always find feet willing to fill them, no matter the cost. Story 4. The Rowan Tree. When we first moved into the old Victorian semi-detached house in Sheffield, the ancient rowan tree in the garden barely registered in my mind. The estate agent had smiled a little too quickly when we asked about it, her expression briefly faltering, before she turned the conversation back to the charming period features and the original fireplace. "It's protected," she said. "Been here forever. Can't move it. I'm afraid." At the time, it felt inconsequential. We were too consumed with the excitement of preparing for Thomas's arrival, our soon-to-be adopted son. After 5 long years of failed pregnancies and another 2 of interviews and paperwork, we were ready to be parents. The house, with its creaky charm and soft light, felt like the right place to begin again. But now, as I sit here in the dark, listening to the whisper of roots beneath the floorboards, I wonder if that rowan tree had been waiting for us all along. Thomas arrived in October, a quiet boy of 10 with large brown eyes and a well-worn sketchbook that rarely left his hands. The social workers had told us he might take time to adjust, but he found comfort in solitude and drew obsessively. They hadn't mentioned his fascination with trees. As we showed him around the house that first day, he said little. When we brought him into his new bedroom, painted soft blue and filled with carefully chosen books, he walked straight to the window and stared out at the garden. "She's beautiful," he whispered, palm against the glass. Emily and I exchanged puzzled glances. All that stood outside was the gnarled rowan tree, its branches sagging under the weight of red berries that glistened even in the grey autumn light. I asked him who he meant. "The tree," he said, not looking away. "Her name is Sarah." The first few weeks passed in careful rhythm, a new family learning to exist together. Thomas was obedient, quiet, and polite, yet distant. He responded when spoken to but rarely volunteered anything. Most afternoons he sat beneath the rowan tree, sketching in silence for hours. When we asked to see his drawings, he would simply close the book and shake his head. Emily found it unsettling but tried to remain positive. "He's adjusting," she would say, though her eyes lingered longer each day on the shadows under his eyes, the circles around the tree where the grass refused to grow, and the leaves that turned black overnight. At first it was easy to dismiss. The dirt on the windowsill, despite the window being locked, the occasional leaf in his bed, even though his room was on the 2nd floor. Then came the scratches, faint at first on the inside of the window pane, like fingernails dragged gently across the glass. It was a misty morning in November when I saw him talking to her. I had stepped outside with a cup of tea and froze on the patio. There, beneath the rowan tree, Thomas sat cross-legged, engaged in conversation with a girl I'd never seen before. She looked no older than 16, with long dark hair hiding most of her face, her form pale and blurred around the edges like smoke. She leaned in close, whispering. I called out. Thomas turned to look at me. The girl was gone. "Who were you talking to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He blinked slowly. "Sarah," he said. "She lives in the tree. She can't go to school anymore. She lost too much blood." My hand tightened on the mug. That night we searched the neighborhood, asked the neighbors, even checked with the local schools. No one knew of a girl named Sarah. Emily tried to laugh it off, but her eyes said something different. Thomas's behavior began to shift. He stopped eating at the table, insisting on taking his meals outside. We found empty plates beneath the rowan tree, arranged in neat circles, always surrounded by small red berries. His school began calling with concerns about his drawings. Pages filled with the same tree, branches extending into impossible shapes, roots twisting like serpents around shadowy figures. The rowan tree didn't shed its leaves in winter. Instead, it seemed to thrive, its red berries growing larger and more vibrant. I caught Thomas standing at the back door one night, his eyes fixed on the tree, whispering words I couldn't make out. When I asked what he was doing, he turned and said, "The tree says you're trying to replace me, but I was here first." His voice didn't sound like a child's. It sounded older, deeper, something borrowed. Everything changed when Emily found out she was pregnant. After years of believing it impossible, the miracle had come unbidden. She was glowing with joy. But Thomas's reaction was ice. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He simply stared at her stomach with unreadable eyes. That night, I heard him whispering again. Only this time, there was an answer. A second voice. Not Sarah's. Something older, more hollow. I pressed my ear to his door. "They won't need me anymore," he whispered. "But the tree says they're wrong. The roots go deep. And they're hungry." I stepped away, heart pounding, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Thomas was gone from his bed, only to be found outside, asleep under the rowan tree, covered in frost and dirt. Emily began to break. Her hands trembled when she folded baby clothes. She found pacifiers outside, buried like offerings at the tree's base. Her garden tools disappeared, then reappeared in a perfect circle around the tree's trunk. The neighborhood cats stopped coming. Birds flew over but never landed. The rowan's branches grew thicker, heavier, and its shadow crept farther across the lawn each night. When our daughter Charlotte was born, she carried a strange birthmark on her shoulder, clusters of dots shaped like rowan berries. Thomas refused to come near her. He began talking to the tree again, louder now, his eyes darker, his skin paler. One night, Emily found him standing over Charlotte's crib, fingers outstretched in claw-like shapes. "There can't be both of us," he whispered. The roots said so. The next morning, without a word, Emily walked outside with an axe. I tried to stop her, but she shoved past me. She made it to the tree and raised the blade once before Thomas came running, screaming in a language I'd never heard, his voice splitting the air like thunder. They struggled. The axe slipped. He fell. The soil opened like a mouth. I remember the sound his body made when it hit the roots, soft and final. We buried him there, under the rowan tree, hands shaking, hearts broken. We told the police he'd run away. There was no body, no proof. But the tree bloomed that winter. White flowers covered its branches. Berries as red as blood glistened in the snow, and Emily changed. She stopped speaking in sentences. She sang now, soft, strange lullabies that made the houseplants grow too quickly, pressing against the windows like they wanted out. Charlotte grew fast, too fast. At 6 months she could walk. At 8, she would stand at the window and wave at something only she could see. One day I found her crib filled with tiny leaves. Another time, berries were arranged in spiral patterns beneath her pillow. Emily spent hours sitting beneath the rowan tree, drinking something dark from 4 teacups placed in a perfect square. When I called her inside, she turned, and her eyes were bark. Her smile was thorns. "He's singing," she said. "Our Thomas is singing to his sister now." Now I sit in my study, unable to sleep. The roots whisper beneath the floorboards. I hear them moving. Charlotte's skin is changing. There are lines like tree rings forming across her shoulders. This morning I saw her speaking to the window, nodding and smiling at someone just beyond the glass. When I asked what she was doing, she pointed and said her first word. "Tree. I want to run. I want to leave this place and take her far away. But I know it's too late. The tree won't let us go. Its roots are in us now, curling around our hearts. I see Thomas in the branches, playing with Sarah. I see Emily growing quieter each day, her skin flaking to reveal bark. And Charlotte just smiles, her small fingers trailing the glass as she watches the rowan tree breathe." Story 5. The Spiral in Cedar Grove. I returned to Cedar Grove in the hush of autumn rain, the kind that falls endlessly without storm or thunder, just a soft, persistent drizzle that coats the world in silver mist and silence. From the window of my childhood bedroom, I watched the rain trace perfect, looping circles down the glass, curling inwards, as if being pulled by some invisible force. I hadn't planned to come back to this little Massachusetts town. I had built a life in Boston, teaching high school physics, drinking bitter coffee, losing myself in predictable routines. But then Sarah called. My oldest friend, practically a sister, her voice tight with worry. "It's Dad," she had said. "He hasn't left his study in weeks. He's taking pictures of spirals. Just spirals." I had laughed nervously, but something in her tone stopped me cold. I packed a bag that night and caught the morning train, unaware that I was walking straight into something I would never fully escape. The Peterson house stood at the end of Sycamore Street, grey with age and sadness. The garden was unkempt except for one detail that made my breath catch. A strange, circular path worn into the grass, like someone had walked the same curved track again and again until it carved itself into the earth. The porch swing creaked slowly in the windless air, moving with a rhythm I couldn't explain. Mrs. Peterson met me at the door, eyes swollen, hair unbrushed. "Thank God you're here," she whispered. "He listens to you." The smell inside was earthy, damp, and somehow biological, like compost mixed with iron. The house was familiar but wrong, as though something had rearranged the air itself. Every picture frame along the hallway had been shifted into spiral patterns, overlapping in strange sequences, like the house itself had begun to coil. I found Dr. Peterson in his study, surrounded by photographs, hundreds of them, layered on every wall, desk, and even the ceiling. Spirals, seashells, galaxies, flowers, weather systems, fingerprints. Some I recognized, others made my skin crawl, their geometry too perfect, too deep. He turned slowly to face me. "Emma," he said with that familiar warmth. "You've come to see it, haven't you?" His eyes darted back to a photo he clutched, a snail shell so magnified it looked like a black hole. "It's in everything. Once you see it, you can't unsee it." His fingers trembled as he traced the spiral with reverence. The golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence. The spiral is the language of the universe. His hair had grown long, curling into natural spirals. His voice was calm, too calm, like someone who had looked into something ancient and accepted what he saw. Over the next few weeks, I tried to convince myself he was simply unwell. He had always been eccentric, a brilliant professor who sparked my love for science with quiet passion and thought-provoking puzzles. But this was different. He barely slept, barely ate. He filled notebooks with sketches of spiral forms, calculating ratios with feverish intensity. He recorded videos of moths circling porch lights, and even filmed coffee spiraling in his mug. When I asked him why, he looked at me with pity. "We're all spinning," he whispered. "You just haven't felt it yet." The town, too, began to change. Small at first, people complaining of nausea, local kids drawing spirals on sidewalks in chalk, church windows repaired in stained glass spiral motifs. At first it felt like coincidence, then like contagion. The high school's biology teacher vanished after reporting that his entire shell collection had been stolen. It was later found carefully arranged into an enormous spiral on the football field. Officer Jenkins drove in circles around the town square for hours one night, claiming he was being called to center. And then there were the dreams. I began waking drenched in sweat, unable to remember what had chased me. But I always woke to the faint sensation of spinning, even when lying still. One morning, the rain stopped. I looked out the window to see the clouds overhead, arranged in a perfect spiral, a slow turn of the heavens. That was the day Sarah found her father, folded inside the washing machine in the garage. He had twisted his limbs unnaturally, curled into a spiral so tight it didn't seem possible. His face was smiling. The coroner called it suicide, though none of them could explain how. After the funeral, the spiral became obsession. It crept into the town like ivy. Flowers in gardens bloomed in perfect Fibonacci swirls. The church choir began humming circular melodies that looped endlessly without resolution. Mrs. Peterson had a breakdown soon after, claiming her own fingerprints were whispering secrets. She cut her hair, then her fingertips, saying the spirals were inside her, turning her brain to glass. They found her curled in her hospital bed, bones twisted in a way that seemed sculptural, like something had shaped her deliberately. When I asked the nurses what happened, one of them said she'd seen a centipede in the room the night before, curled into a spiral that never uncoiled. She said it looked at her with human eyes. I stayed. I told myself it was to help Sarah, who had begun walking in slow, looping patterns when she thought no one was watching. Her sentences circled back. Her handwriting became curves, spirals within spirals. "It's beautiful, Emma," she said one night. "It's not evil. It's just the truth. We're all part of the pattern." That same night, the town's weather report described the storm over Cedar Grove as a tightly spinning atmospheric anomaly. The rain returned in droplets that spiraled as they fell, leaving marks on windows that grew each day, expanding into the rooms like ripples. I went for a walk and found myself surrounded. People dancing in spirals at the park, children tracing loops in the sand, shop signs arranged into circular displays. It was everywhere. Inescapable. Like a song I hadn't realized I'd been humming my entire life. I tried to leave. I packed my car and headed for the highway, but the GPS rerouted me again and again. The roads twisted. The trees leaned inward. I found myself back at the town square, headlights reflecting off spirals carved into the fountain stone. That night, Sarah changed completely. Her spine seemed to move beneath her skin. I watched frozen as her vertebrae turned one by one. It's in your DNA, in your breath, in your thoughts. The spiral is everything. I ran. I ran past windows warping into loops, past dogs curled into symbols they should not understand, past mailboxes spinning on their hinges. But I never got far, because the spiral isn't just around me, it's in me. Now, I sit in my childhood room again, watching the shadows move in circles across the walls. My hair, once straight, now curls without cause. My handwriting loops in tighter and tighter coils. When I close my eyes, I see galaxies unfolding into spirals of light. See snails dragging infinity across a garden floor. See my own cells dividing into sacred geometry. The storm above Cedar Grove hasn't stopped. It spins endlessly, a vortex overhead. I know now why Dr. Peterson smiled. The spiral isn't madness. It's clarity. It's the shape of reality, whispering to us through every leaf, every turn of fate. And once you understand that, there's no turning back. Only in. Story 6. The Locked Room. The first thing I noticed about the house was the smell. Not the musty aroma of old wood and aging wallpaper you'd expect from a Victorian-era home in northern Michigan, but something colder, cleaner, yet wrong. It was the sterile bite of disinfectant, like a hospital hallway that's trying too hard to hide what it can't scrub away. The red brick house stood tall and narrow, flanked by weeping oaks that drooped under their own weight, branches brushing the windows like they were trying to whisper something. My mother stood beside me in the driveway, her hand resting on my shoulder, her smile forced. "It just needs some love, Alex," she said, as if that would be enough. But her eyes didn't quite match her voice, and her hand trembled slightly before she let go. I didn't respond. I just stared up at the windows. Some houses feel alive. This one felt like it was watching. We moved in on a late August afternoon. My parents were excited, hopeful even, about the fresh start. I had just turned 19 and was enrolled in community college nearby. My older brother Michael had moved back in after losing his job, though he barely acknowledged me as we unpacked boxes. I noticed the door on the second floor hallway the first time I passed it. It wasn't remarkable at a glance. Solid oak, brass handle, same as the others. But it was the only one that didn't open. When I asked about it, my father shrugged. "Previous owner's belongings," he said without looking up from his phone. "Part of the sale agreement. We don't touch it." That was it. No key. No further explanation. It didn't sit right with me, but I let it go. For a little while. In the following weeks, I tried to focus on adjusting to my new classes and surroundings, but the house kept demanding attention. The smell never left. It got stronger near the locked door, sharp and metallic, like old blood beneath antiseptic. I'd wake in the night to the sound of soft footsteps pacing just outside my room, but every time I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The mirrors in the upstairs bathroom sometimes showed things moving behind me, faint and blurred, shadows that didn't belong. One afternoon I found a dead fly on my windowsill, its body twisted in on itself, wings tucked in unnatural spirals. When I looked away and looked back, it was gone. I didn't tell anyone. I wanted to believe it was stress, but the house was peeling at the edges of what I understood as normal. Michael began acting strange too. At first it was subtle. He spoke less, laughed at odd times, smiled too wide and for too long. Then he started standing in the hallway, just outside the locked door, for minutes at a time, silent, unmoving. When I confronted him, he denied it, said I was imagining things. One night, during a thunderstorm, I found him on the porch, soaked and staring at nothing. "It's stuffy inside," he said, but his eyes didn't match his voice. The next morning he was gone. No note, no message. His room untouched, his bed made, closet full. My parents didn't react the way I expected. They didn't panic. They didn't even search. "He probably needed a break," Mom said, brushing crumbs from the table. "He'll be back." But she didn't sound convinced. She sounded like she was reading from a script. I went to the police, and they took the report politely, but there was a hollowness to the process, like a game being played with missing rules. The lead officer smiled too much, jotted in a notebook that didn't seem to have any pages. He said they'd look into it, and asked no real questions. When I got home, my parents were in the living room, watching static on the television and smiling blankly. "You worry too much," Dad said without turning his head. "Things disappear sometimes." I stopped sleeping properly. Each night I lay awake listening to the walls breathe, to the pipes whisper. I began to hear scratching from behind the locked door. Faint at first, like mice, then louder, rhythmic, intentional. I began dreaming of narrow hallways and flickering lights, of long stretches of time where I couldn't remember who I was or why I was afraid. On the 20th morning after Michael vanished, I woke to find him sitting at the kitchen table. His clothes were dry, his hair perfectly combed, his posture too perfect. He looked like Michael, but he wasn't. I could see it in the way his head tilted too far when he laughed, in the way his eyes didn't blink when he stared. "Where have you been?" I asked, my voice shaking. He smiled. "Memory loss. Doctor says it's trauma-induced. I don't remember much." He shrugged like it meant nothing, like he hadn't disappeared for weeks without a trace. My parents welcomed him back as though nothing had happened. I watched as he moved through the house with uncanny precision, repeating the same gestures each morning, humming the same tune at the exact same time. It was like watching a loop in a video file, almost human, but not quite. That night, I stood outside the locked door again. The smell was stronger than ever, rot and bleach and something colder, older. I pressed my ear against it. The scratching had stopped. Now there was breathing, shallow, wet breathing. I knocked once. The sound on the other side paused. Then, softly, a whisper. "Ale." I ran back to my room and didn't sleep. The next morning, my phone showed a different date, September 15th, 2039. But that wasn't right. It was 2019. I was sure of it. I checked calendars, clocks, online news feeds. Everything said it was 20 years later. My face in the mirror was older, lined, my hair thinner, my voice deeper. But my memories hadn't changed. My journal still said 2019. My body, however, told another story. My hands trembled like a stranger's. My knees ached. I remembered none of it. The police laughed when I returned to them. "Mr. Bennett," they said, "you were reported missing in 2020. You reappeared 2 days ago. This is your home. Your family filed no charges. Everything is in order." They showed me identification, cards and documents I didn't remember owning, all with my photo, all from the year 2039. My mind tried to fold in on itself. I wandered the streets of a town that looked familiar but wrong. Technology had changed. People walked with floating screens, with devices I couldn't name. Buildings had grown taller. Cars drove themselves. I came back to the house because I had nowhere else to go, and when I opened the front door, Michael was waiting. "You came back," he said, smiling just a little too wide. "We're glad." Now I sit at my desk, this journal open in front of me, trying to make sense of time that doesn't fit. My reflection flickers between a teenager and a man in his late 30s. The house has shifted. The locked door no longer seems out of place. Its handle is warm now, like it's been waiting for me. My parents sit in the living room, staring at the wall, murmuring a song I don't recognize. And Michael no longer sleeps. He stands by my bed each night, watching, smiling. You were the last one, he told me this morning. Now we're all here. The scratching has started again, this time from the inside of my head. I think I've been here before. I think I've written these words before, but the spiral begins again. The door is still locked, or maybe it's already open. Story 7. The house that wasn't there. The town of Fairview was quiet, the kind of place where people waved at their neighbors and lawnmowers buzzed like background music every Saturday morning. Nothing much ever happened here, or so I believed, until the day a house appeared on Everwood Lane. I'd driven that road countless times over the years, often cutting through on my way to the grocery store. It was a dead-end street lined with maples and two-story colonials built in the 50s, every lawn trimmed, every curtain drawn just enough. But last Tuesday there was something new. A large grey house at the very end of the road, one that hadn't been there the day before. I didn't notice it at first. In fact, I nearly missed it. It blended in too well. Perfectly painted siding, a porch with hanging planters, and a red front door with gleaming brass numbers, 315. At first I told myself I'd just never noticed it. Maybe I was too distracted, too used to the scenery to register a house that had always been there, but that didn't sit right. I had delivered papers here as a kid. I remembered there being an empty lot at the end of Everwood, just grass and dandelions, and a rotting wooden fence. I called my friend Sam, who had lived in Fairview all his life. You ever seen the house on 315 Everwood? I asked. There was a pause. There isn't a 315, he said slowly. The street ends at 311, always has. But when I drove back the next day, the house was still there. Exactly the same. Grey siding, red door, planters blooming with petunias that hadn't been there the day before. I sat in my car and watched it for a long time. No cars in the driveway, no lights, no sound. I knocked on a few doors nearby, asking if anyone knew who lived there. Mrs. Kinley, who had lived at 309 for decades, gave me a confused look. What house? She asked. That one, I said, pointing down the street. But when she looked, her face blanked. Honey, there's nothing there, just the old lot. I looked again. The house was still there. The windows reflected the sunlight. The curtains inside swayed slightly. But when I glanced back at her, she was already closing her door, muttering something I couldn't catch. I returned later that evening, just as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows over the asphalt. I stood at the base of the driveway and stared. I could feel something then, a pull, like gravity, but stranger. The air around the house was heavier, quieter, and the longer I stood there, the more I felt like I was being watched from the upstairs window. Curiosity won. I stepped onto the porch and pressed my hand to the door. It was warm. The brass knob turned easily, and the door creaked open with surprising smoothness. Inside, the house was clean. Not empty, but staged, like a model home. A bowl of wax fruit sat on the kitchen table. The living room held a muted television displaying static. The upstairs hallway was lined with family photos, but none of the faces were clear. They were smudged, blurred just enough that I couldn't recognize them. One photo showed a man holding a child. Another had a woman standing in a garden, but their features melted into one another like wet ink. I called out, but no one answered, and yet I could feel it. The sense that I was not alone. The air was still. Not stale, but too still, like it hadn't moved in years. I wandered deeper into the house. Every room was pristine, but wrong. The clocks all ticked in unison, but none showed the same time. The mirrors reflected the room, but not me. I stood in front of one in the master bedroom for nearly 5 minutes, staring at the empty reflection, heart pounding. Then something behind me moved. I turned. Nothing. But the hallway light had turned off. I hadn't heard a switch. My phone showed no signal. I decided to leave, to forget the whole thing. But when I tried to open the front door, it wouldn't budge. Not locked, just immovable, like part of the wall. Panic started to creep in. I rushed to a window, but when I looked outside, the street was gone. In its place was an endless grey fog, pressing up against the glass like a sea waiting to rise. I ran to the staircase and stopped dead. There was someone at the top. A silhouette, tall, unmoving. I blinked, and it was gone, but a sound followed, the creaking of floorboards above me, slowly, deliberately. I backed into the kitchen, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy glass bowl, and held it close. The creaking stopped, silence again, and then a whisper from inside the wall. "You're already part of it." I dropped the bowl. It shattered, but made no sound. None. Just silence, like the house swallowed it whole. I ran back to the front door, slammed my shoulder into it again and again. Nothing. I screamed. The lights flickered. The photographs on the wall changed. Now the blurred man had my jacket, my hair, my face. The woman in the garden had my mother's smile. The child's face was missing. Time slipped. I don't know how long I stayed there. Minutes, hours, days. The house didn't let me sleep. The static never stopped. I wandered rooms that weren't there before. Rooms that vanished when I returned. The attic stretched on endlessly, filled with boxes labeled with names I recognized. Names of people I knew. People I'd forgotten. One day, I opened a box labeled James Halley, my grandfather. Inside were objects from his life I had never seen. His dog tags, a child's drawing with his name on it, and a cassette tape that played his voice saying my name. He had died before I was born. I cried, not because I missed him, but because the house knew him better than I did, and it knew me too, better than I ever would. Eventually, the front door opened on its own. No sound, no light from outside, just a familiar street, as if nothing had happened. I stumbled out and turned to look. The house was gone. The lot was back. Empty. Overgrown. No footprints. No door. My phone worked again. 48 minutes had passed. That's what the timestamp said. But I felt years older. My hands shook. My eyes burned. I went home and didn't tell anyone. What could I say? That I entered a house no one else could see? That it knew my past? That it wanted something I still don't understand? But sometimes I drive down Everwood Lane, just to see. And every now and then, just when the sky turns grey and the air is still, I see the house again, sitting silently at the end of the road, waiting. I no longer get out of the car. I don't knock. I don't approach. I don't speak its address aloud, but I think about it. And I know that one day when I'm weakest, when I'm tired or curious or reckless, I'll go back, because the house remembers me. Because now I see it in my dreams, in reflections, in the corners of empty rooms. And I know it's waiting, just waiting, for the moment I open the door again and never come out. Story 8. The Man in the Reflection. When I first moved into the apartment on Ashbridge Lane, I thought it was the beginning of something good. The space was small but cozy, tucked above an old bookstore with a crooked awning and creaky floors. It smelled of parchment and dust, the kind of scent that made you want to wrap yourself in a blanket, and read until morning. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but I was fresh out of college with more dreams than dollars, so I signed the lease without a second thought. It was quiet most nights, with only the occasional clatter of bookshelves downstairs, or the soft chime of the bell when the store owner, Mr. Ellery, came in late. For a while, it felt like I had found a hidden pocket of peace in the middle of a chaotic world. But then the mirror began to change. There was a tall mirror in the hallway just outside my bedroom, an antique thing with an ornate wooden frame that curled into leaf-like shapes. It came with the apartment, and though it was a little taller than I needed, I liked its presence. For weeks, it was just that, a mirror. But one night, as I brushed my teeth with the door open, I noticed something off. My reflection wasn't brushing its teeth. It was watching me. Eyes locked, still as a painting. I froze, toothbrush in hand, heart starting to pound. I blinked. The reflection blinked with me. Then it lifted its hand and waved. I did not wave back. I stared, frozen, until the reflection resumed mirroring my actions, as if nothing had happened. I told myself I had imagined it, that I was tired, that reflections didn't wave first. Over the next few days, things escalated. I'd catch my reflection pausing too long, staring into my eyes like it was trying to recognize me. Once it smiled while I frowned. Another time, It stepped away from the frame when I stayed still. I tried everything to rationalize it. Sleep deprivation, stress, a trick of the light. But deep down I knew better. One evening I covered the mirror with an old sheet. I couldn't bear to see it anymore. But in the middle of the night, I woke to a sound like scratching wood. When I opened the door to the hallway, the sheet was gone. The mirror stood uncovered, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. My reflection smiled. I didn't. I avoided the mirror as much as I could after that, but it never stopped watching. Sometimes I would hear whispers when passing by, low and indistinct. They sounded like my name, like old memories being breathed into the air. I called my friend Andrea and asked her to come over. I just need a second opinion, I told her. She came the next night, wine bottle in hand, cheerful and chatty until she caught sight of the mirror. She stopped talking immediately, her face going pale. "That mirror," she said quietly. "It's not right." I asked what she meant, but she shook her head. "When I looked at it, I didn't see you. I saw someone else standing behind me." We both slept in the living room that night with every light on. I did some research. I found old news clippings in the local archive, articles about the building's previous tenants. One name came up repeatedly. Jonathan Rourke. A quiet man, lived alone, disappeared in 1983 without a trace. Some said he was seen in his window, talking to his reflection. One story claimed he believed the mirror wanted to trade places. The day after I read that, I noticed the reflection was wearing different clothes than me, slightly different, like an echo of an outfit I had worn the week before. I touched the glass. It was cold, too cold. The face on the other side did not move. Then it smiled, and my hand started to burn. I started dreaming about the man in the mirror. Always the same. He stands in my hallway, waiting, watching. His eyes are black, too wide, his movements smooth like water. In one dream I saw him step out of the mirror entirely and walk down the hallway into my room. I woke up screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat. But the mirror was exactly where it had always been. My reflection, however, was facing away from me. When I moved, it didn't. Only when I whispered, "What do you want?" did it slowly turn to face me. And then, in my own voice, it said, "To be you." I fell to my knees, unable to look away, as my reflection raised its hand and touched the inside of the glass. The next few days were a blur. Time began to feel unsteady, like it was folding in on itself. I would find myself in places I didn't remember walking to. Items in my apartment would move on their own. Photos would show two of me, one in the foreground smiling and another in the background watching. I became afraid to sleep, afraid that if I closed my eyes, I would wake up on the wrong side of the mirror. Andrea stopped answering my calls. Mr. Ellery, the bookstore owner, avoided eye contact when I passed by. Everyone seemed distant, like I was fading from their memory. Or maybe I already had. I wrote letters, made voice recordings, documenting everything. I was terrified that I was being erased piece by piece, replaced by something else. Then came the final night. The night the lights flickered and all the mirrors in the apartment shattered, except the one. The hallway mirror remained intact, pristine, waiting. I stood before it, trembling, and this time, the reflection was perfect. It moved when I moved. It blinked when I blinked. But I knew it wasn't me. There was something in its eyes, certainty, hunger. I stepped back, and the reflection stepped forward. Then, impossibly, it pushed. The glass didn't resist. I felt it ripple like water, and then a hand came through, cold, smooth, gripping my arm. I screamed, tried to pull back, but it was stronger. The hallway bent, the walls twisted, and the world went white. Now I sit in a room that looks like mine but isn't. Everything is slightly off, too symmetrical, too clean. When I move, the world delays, like it's thinking. I no longer cast a reflection, and in the mirror, I see someone else, someone trapped, someone screaming. It wears my face now. It walks my streets. It calls Andrea and laughs in my voice. It reads my books and pretends to dream. And me, I wait, watching, hoping someone will look into the mirror long enough to see me, to remember me, to bring me back. Because I don't belong here. The reflection lied. It doesn't want to be me. It wants to be free. Story 9. The camp that wasn't on the map. When my cousin Jacob invited me to join him and a group of friends on a camping trip deep in the northern woods, I hesitated. I wasn't much of an outdoorsman, and the idea of spending a weekend off-grid didn't exactly thrill me, but he insisted it would be good for me. Fresh air, no phones, real bonding time. I gave in, packed a bag, and found myself crammed into the back of a rusty Jeep alongside gear, firewood, and 3 people I barely knew. The drive took hours, winding through narrow dirt roads past old gas stations with flickering neon signs, and through towns that seemed frozen in time. Eventually the trees thickened, and the signal bars on our phones disappeared one by one until we were truly disconnected. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees when we arrived. The clearing where we set up camp was beautiful, almost too beautiful. Tall pines surrounded us in every direction, and a crystal clear lake shimmered nearby, reflecting the golds and purples of the twilight sky. There were no signs of human activity, no trails, no tire marks, not even trash. "This place isn't on any public maps," Jacob said with a grin. "Found it using old ranger documents from the 70s. That should have been my first warning." But the air smelled like pine and lake water, and the fire crackled warmly as night fell. For a while, I forgot my unease. We laughed, told stories, roasted food, and passed around a bottle of cheap whiskey. It felt like something out of a memory I never had. That first night I woke up suddenly. No sound, no movement, just an overwhelming sense that something was off. The fire was out, and the forest was silent in a way I didn't know forests could be. I stepped out of the tent and looked around. Everyone else was asleep. I took a few cautious steps toward the lake, drawn by the moonlight reflecting off its surface. That's when I saw them. Figures standing just at the edge of the trees on the far side of the water. They weren't moving. I couldn't see their faces, only the silhouettes, tall and still and spaced too evenly apart. I blinked, and they were gone. I told myself it was just a trick of the light. A half-asleep brain in unfamiliar surroundings. I didn't tell anyone the next morning. They were all too cheerful, joking and sipping coffee like nothing had happened. I didn't want to ruin the mood. The second night, things got stranger. We had all turned in when I heard footsteps circling the tent. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath. Then came a low humming noise, like someone softly singing just out of earshot. I peeked out, but there was nothing there. Just the dying embers of the fire and the towering dark of the trees. The next morning, I found strange patterns in the dirt outside the tent. Circles and spirals and symbols I couldn't place. I showed them to Jacob, but he laughed and said I was probably dreaming. Maybe I was, but when I went to fill my water bottle at the lake, I saw something caught in the reeds. A small bundle of feathers and bones, wrapped in what looked like animal skin. I left it there. I didn't even touch it. That afternoon the air changed. It got colder, heavier, though the sun was still up. Birds stopped chirping. The wind died. We all felt it. Even the others grew quiet. One of Jacob's friends, Mark, said he had a headache so bad it felt like his skull was vibrating. We decided to pack up and leave early. But when we tried to find the trail that led us in, it wasn't there. The path was gone. Not overgrown. Gone. As if it had never been there. We searched in pairs, tried GPS. Even though we had no signal, nothing worked. The trees seemed to shift when we weren't looking. I began marking them with chalk, but the marks vanished minutes later. We were lost, truly lost. That night we didn't sleep. We huddled around the fire, too afraid to drift off. In the distance, we heard sounds that didn't belong to any animal we knew. Clicking, rhythmic tapping, and a long, low moaning like the earth itself was crying. At one point, Mark got up and walked into the woods. We shouted after him, chased him, but he was gone. Just gone. We looked for hours but found nothing. When we returned, something was waiting by the fire, an arrangement of sticks and bones shaped like a crude figure. Its arms were pointing outward, toward the lake. None of us spoke. We sat in silence until dawn, barely breathing. At first light, we made a plan. We would head toward the lake and follow the shoreline until we found civilization, or anything that looked familiar. As we walked, The fog began to roll in. It was thick, unnatural, too heavy for morning mist. I kept thinking I saw figures just beyond the trees, glimpses of movement, tall and slow and wrong. We found a wooden sign half buried in the dirt. It read, "Welcome back." That made no sense. None of us had ever been here. The air smelled of iron and wet soil. I heard whispers when no one was talking. The world felt like it was folding in on itself, like we were walking in a loop we couldn't escape. By evening, we stumbled back into the clearing, the exact same one we had camped in. Our gear was there, untouched. The fire pit was cold. It was as if we'd never left. That broke something in us. Jacob started laughing uncontrollably. One girl, Marla, sat down and refused to move. "It wants us to stay," she whispered. "It doesn't want us to leave." We tried everything, climbing trees, following the sun, even building markers as we walked. Each attempt brought us back to the same place. Days passed, or maybe just hours. Time lost all meaning. Our food dwindled. The whispers grew louder. One night I dreamt of the lake opening like a mouth, swallowing us one by one. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. I woke up in my tent to the sound of cars, real cars. I stumbled out and saw a ranger's truck parked just beyond the trees. The trail was back. The forest looked normal. Birds chirped. Sunlight filtered through the branches like it always had. We were rescued. Or so they said. But when I tried to explain what happened, the rangers exchanged looks and gently asked if I'd been drinking. Mark was never found. The rest of us said nothing. We just nodded and returned to our lives. But something stayed behind. Something watches. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that humming again. Not outside, inside, deep in my bones. And sometimes when I drive past the tree line, I see a glimmer of the lake in the distance, still and perfect and waiting. I never stop. I never go back. But I know if I did, it would remember me, just like it remembers all of us, because that camp, it wasn't on the map for a reason. It doesn't want to be found. It finds you.